In last week's Senate race in Alabama, Doug Jones was able to actually defeat Roy Moore, primarily because he was one of two candidates in that race that wasn't a pedophile. Now, the most important takeaway from that race is that without black voters, Doug Jones's victory was absolutely not possible, because 93% of black men voted for Jones and 98% of black women voted for him as well. So if there's any conclusion that Doug Jones should take away from his victory, it's that you got elected because of black voters. So when you get in office, you better damn well make sure you do everything in your power to represent them well. And Charles Barkley on CNN actually echoed this same exact sentiment.
Well, this is a wake-up call for Democrats. Your Democrats, and I told Mr. Jones this, and I love Doug, they've taken the black vote and the poor vote for granted for a long time. It's time for them to get off their ass and start making life better for black folks and people who are poor. They've always had our votes, and they have abused our votes, and this is a wake-up call. We got it in a great position now, but this is a wake-up call for Democrats to do better for black people and poor white people.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. That is the exact lesson you should take away from this, and thankfully, DNC Chairman Tom Perez agrees. Yes, black voters absolutely carried Doug Jones to victory.
And we have to recognize that, as I said earlier this week, African-American women in particular, and African-Americans generally, are indeed the backbone of the Democratic Party, and precisely because they are the backbone of the Democratic Party, we should never take them for granted. And in the past, we have. And we've been going to school on that in the new Democratic National Committee, not only in Alabama, but in Virginia, in mayor's races, and elsewhere. And that's how we win.
Finally, Tom Perez is right about one thing. That is the correct conclusion to draw from this event. However, not all Democrats agree with the takeaway that's obvious. In fact, Joe Manchin has a different take on this issue.
Well, I just think it speaks volumes for what we call the radical middle, those of us still in the moderate middle, centrist Democrats, and for Doug to coming from Alabama is going to be a big plus, be able to work in that middle. But I just told Doug to be an Alabama Democrat. Don't have to be a Washington Democrat.
Voters in Alabama were so inspired by Doug Jones's radical centrism that they came out in droves to support him. It's not because Roy Moore is a pedophile and they wanted to defeat him. It's because they were inspired by Doug Jones. That is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard, and it's absolutely the opposite conclusion that you should be taking away from this election, Joe. And unfortunately, Joe Manchin is one of many Democrats that are now using Doug Jones's victory as evidence that the Democratic Party doesn't actually have to be progressive or run actual left-wing candidates in order to win elections. They can win everywhere if they just run Republicans with D's in front of their names. But again, that's wrong. If you are elected by the people, you have to adequately represent the people. Therefore, Doug Jones, since he was elected by black voters, his electoral victory would not be possible without them. He should be doing everything in his power to make sure that they are satisfied with him. Now, what matters overall more than anything else is what Doug Jones is going to do. It doesn't matter what Joe Manchin says. It doesn't matter what Charles Barkley or Tom Perez says. All that matters is that Doug Jones will in fact do the right thing and actually represent black voters. However, he's dropping some hints on us that he might actually just get in and govern like a Republican anyway.
I've received calls from Democratic senators. I've received calls from my longtime friend, Senator Shelby, Leader McConnell, Leader Schumer, and calls from the President of the United States, President Trump, all very gracious, congratulating us on the way we have run this race, the way we portrayed ourselves and the campaign, and all expressing a desire to look forward together to try to work for the betterment of the state of Alabama and this country, to do as we have said from the very beginning of this campaign, to try to find common ground.
So there's your first hint about the kind of Democrat Doug Jones will be. He was happy to receive calls from Republicans, and he's looking forward to finding common ground with them. How are you going to find common ground with a party that always pushes for policies that disproportionately harms the demographic that got you elected? How are you going to find common ground with a radical right-wing party, Doug? How is that possible? So already we're seeing signs that Doug Jones is not going to represent black voters who got him elected. And we saw more signs about the kind of Democrat he's going to be because he states that he will promise to consider voting Republican and said explicitly, quote, "Don't expect me to vote solidly for Republicans or Democrats." Well, of course not. I mean, why on earth would we expect you to vote with the party whose constituents made your victory possible? Unbelievable. They carried him to victory, and he's going to get in office and align with Republicans. Now, he also urged Congress to move on from Trump's numerous sexual misconduct allegations, telling Jake Tapper that he doesn't believe the president should resign, even though Al Franken resigned for doing less than what Trump did. So, Doug Jones presumably thinks that if he acts like a Republican once he arrives at the Senate, that will increase the chance that he's elected. The problem is that in acting like a Republican and voting with Republicans, he's betraying the very voters that made his electoral victory possible in the first place, and he's already signaling that he's going to get in there and not represent them. And look, the way that Doug Jones is acting here is not an anomaly. This is how Democrats consistently treat their most loyal voting bloc. Black voters help Democrats get elected, they then get in office and don't represent them adequately, or at all. Now, people are probably going to say, Mike, but if he's too liberal, then he's not going to get elected again. But I hate to break it to you, Doug, you weren't elected because voters like you. You were elected because you're not a pedophile. And this Trump voter who actually voted against Roy Moore summed up the situation perfectly.
Doug Jones is going to be there 2 years, then he'll be gone.
Then you think a Republican will be back?
Oh, yeah, he'll be back. They could have run a three-legged dog against Roy Moore. They would have won, you know.
So in Alabama, they really don't like Democrats, Doug. No matter how much you align yourself with Republicans, that doesn't change the fact that you're probably not going to be reelected. So what you can do, however, is try something different for a change. Try being progressive and representing the people who got you elected, and maybe, just maybe, that will galvanize the liberal voters that do exist in Alabama. That might encourage them to come out and actually vote for you in 2 years. Try pushing for policies that benefit the people that helped you get elected. And if you lose, then at least you could say you represented your constituents well. But we already know what Doug Jones is going to do. He's going to do what every other centrist Democrat does that comes from a moderately conservative state. He's going to play it safe and go along with Republicans' harmful plans. Well, look, if you're gonna be a middle of the road Democrat, then you're not being liberal at all. You're just being right wing, because when you live in a country where the Overton window is shifted so far to the right, well, when you play it safe and be a centrist, you're just the right winger in that scenario. So if you actually want to have a chance, you have to be liberal, you have to be progressive, and you actually have to represent the people who made your electoral victory possible. But unfortunately for the people of Alabama, they're most likely going to be disappointed by Doug Jones. And he's going to learn the hard way that pretending to be a Republican is not going to help him get elected again.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.